Hello, and welcome to this professional development webinar, Dimension 3, Evaluating Sources and Using Evidence. This webinar, along with others in our series, are part of the C3LC, short for the College, Career, and Civic Life Framework for Social Studies State Standards Literacy Collaborative, which NCSS is implementing in collaboration with the National Center for Literacy and Education, NCLE, and which is funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. My name is Anna Post, and I'm the Director of External Relations and Council Communications at NCSS, as well as this program's project coordinator. The goal of this initiative is to create and operationalize a plan designed specifically for social studies teachers to implement the Common Core State Standards for English Language Arts and Literacy in History, Social Studies, Science, and Technical Subjects by utilizing the College, Career, and Civic Life C3 framework for Social Studies State Standards. This webinar is produced in conjunction with an in-depth investigation in which C3LC project pilot teacher groups can take information from this webinar, investigate the content further, and connect it to their work by visiting the Literacy and Learning Exchange website. Non-project participants will also be able to access the project activities and learning modules, but will not have direct access to the coaching supports that will be provided by the grant to pilot group teacher teams. Before I introduce our presenter today, I just wanted to remind you not to hesitate in sharing your comments or questions via the chat box on your lower right-hand corner. Our presenter will also ask for your feedback and comments at specific points during his presentation via polls. With that, let me introduce today's presenter, Dr. Scott Waring. Dr. Waring is an associate professor at the University of Central Florida, where he teaches courses at the undergraduate and graduate level in social science education methodology, research, and theory. He is the director of the Teaching with Primary Sources program at University of Central Florida and serves as the chair for the Teacher Education and Professional Development Community of NCSS, the chair of CITES, Social Studies Special Interest Group, and is the interdisciplinary feature editor for Social Studies Research and Practice. Dr. Waring, thank you for being with us today and doing this presentation.
Thank you, Anna. I'm thrilled to be here this evening, and I definitely appreciate all the educators who have joined us. I know that it's a busy time, and if you're here this evening, then you're definitely dedicated to teaching social studies, so I appreciate everything that you do. Tonight, we're going to go over a couple things, and we have a short amount of time, and I always try to provide as much as I can in the short time that I'm given, and so I'll move fairly quickly. But if I do run over something or you have some questions, don't hesitate, as Anna said, to utilize the chat board. I'm definitely willing to stop at any point in time. But a quick overview of what we'll be doing. We're going to talk a little bit about the purpose of this webinar and your investigation, as well as tying in an overview of the C3 framework, Dimension 3. I know most of you are really familiar with it, so I won't take a lot of time on it, but at least to give a little bit of a sense of why I'm doing what I'm doing this evening and where we're going with that. And then I'll follow the majority of the time up with some strategies and approaches that I utilize for teaching with primary sources, and then hoping to build the capacity within students so that they'll be able to construct their own evidence-based narratives. I do spend a lot of my time focusing in on primary sources and teaching with primary sources, so this is really enjoyable for me. So hopefully you'll see some great things tonight that you'll enjoy as well and be able to utilize. Obviously, if I were building to the full capacity of allowing students to really engage in that disciplined inquiry, there's additional steps, so it's the serious abbreviated version that you're getting this evening, but hopefully you can fill in the gaps and enjoy what we discussed tonight. So the purpose of this webinar investigation is really trying to find ways to practice sourcing and really focusing in on evaluating documents and primary sources to create those evidence-based narratives. We're also, number two, looking at ways in which teachers can guide students to first evaluate sources and then gather them in the historical inquiry process. And lastly, how to source the documents, analyze information, and examine multiple perspectives that will lead them to constructing some kind of conclusion based on the evidence. So as I mentioned, we'll talk quickly about the C3 dimension 3. Really with C3, the dimension 3 really focuses in on the skills that students need to analyze information, come to conclusions with a specific focus on gathering and evaluating sources and developing claims and using evidence, which should lead them to constructing their own authentic evidence-based narratives. They also, in this process, will use various technologies and skills. So specifically, what are those indicators when we're talking about dimension 3? As I just mentioned a moment ago in the definition or the description of dimension 3, talked a little bit about evaluating sources first and then moving towards gathering sources and then using that in developing claims and using that evidence and ultimately, as I said, those narratives that students can construct. So as students are gathering and evaluating sources, really what it's all about is, the students are constructing opinions, explanations, arguments, and they start gathering that information from a variety of sources. So not only, we talk a lot of times about documents, but also many other types of primary sources. And then they can evaluate the relevance of them and then keep in mind while they're doing that maybe not all sources are relevant to their task, or some sources are more valid and reliable than others. So they should corroborate and really closely analyze each of the sources as they're going through them. So as we look at that progression along the continuum that they've constructed, the authors of the C3 framework, we really see that early on we're asking students to gather relevant information from just a few sources. And I would argue that that would also be at higher grades for students who haven't had an opportunity to engage with primary sources in the past. That's one thing that I'll kind of discuss a little bit tonight, and one thing that I've found in my experience, and many of you have probably seen that as well, is that when we give students who have never had any exposure to teaching with primary sources a large set of documents, much like the document-based questions, and ask them to construct an evidence-based narrative without having ever had any experience in utilizing primary sources, it can be extremely overwhelming. So I would argue that not only at the lower grades, but then for the novice level learners, when we're talking about historical inquiry, they would need a little bit of an opportunity to work with singular sources, a few sources building up to multiple sources as we see along that continuum, and then start thinking specifically about origin, authority, structure, context, and then corroborative value as they start gathering more and more sources, and they can build to that capacity where they can actually utilize many sources, examine the value of them, and construct the narratives. So the second area of this is really developing claims and using evidence. So this subsection really looks at the idea of argumentation, which is that ability to understand the source to evidence relationship. We're looking at the emphasis on the development of claims and counterclaims, and that purposeful selection of evidence, and always analyzing the validity of particular sources. So once again, the continuum, we look at this. They talk about it really beginning in grades 5, really facilitating that process through K through 4, building up to 5, where they really start looking at identifying evidence that draws information from multiple sources, building all the way up to grade 12, where it's much more complex, where there's multiple sources detecting inconsistencies. And once again, really the ultimate goal is utilizing many different sources, creating their own narratives, their own arguments based on the evidence that is there. So we're going to move towards some approaches that I utilize in constructing really a historical mindset or historical thinking within our student base. And as I said, I am a big fan of utilizing primary sources, but I've found in not only K through 12 students, but many times pre-service teachers at the university level, and even in-service teachers, sometimes have different definitions of what primary sources are, or have some questions on really how do you define them properly. So the first thing I want to do tonight is really start thinking about what primary and secondary sources are, so then we can start working with some of them. So if Anna could post the first poll, first thing I want you to do is, if you could for me, think about what are primary sources and list some items that you would consider to be primary sources. So hopefully you see the poll in front of you. There should be an area for you to type in your answer. And if you would just list an item and enter, and you may list more than one item, but if you do it in a separate response, what are primary sources? So I see a diary. Excellent. So just start listing any items that you would consider to be a primary source. Are we seeing journals, congressional records, newspapers, magazines, political cartoons, photos, maps? A lot of terrific answers. Any other thoughts? Music, coins, fossils, personal accounts. And this is my first experience utilizing the poll here in Adobe Connect. And Anna, I don't know if you can respond quickly, but it maybe appears that anytime somebody submits a new thought, it erases their old one. Is that correct?
That is correct. Thank you for catching on to that. I have seen that what people are doing is including their additional responses along with their first one. And so that's a good strategy to follow. Thank you for pointing that out, Scott.
Thank you, Anna. Okay, so then keep that in mind as we continue and we do some more open-ended polls. Then you can list all of your items, and then when you're ready to submit, then you can submit your response, and then we can see everything that you listed, and nothing will be erased. But I see some other things with Federalist Papers, speeches, coins, music, personal accounts, diaries, all kinds of great things listed here. So we've talked a little bit about what primary sources can be. There's a lot of items listed there. We're going to get into a definition in a couple slides, but then let's contrast that with secondary sources. So if Anna could pull up that poll, since we've talked a little bit about what are some of those primary sources, what are secondary sources? What would you consider to be a secondary source? So as I said, list your item, comma, another item, and then when you're ready to submit it, then please submit your response. And obviously it doesn't have to be an exhaustive list, but if you want to list 3 or 4 or 5, whatever that is, that would be wonderful. All right, I see textbook and historical fiction, biographies, historian's text, summaries of the first-hand accounts, textbooks, encyclopedias, Wikipedia. Definitely a lot of students utilize Wikipedia. Movies and TV shows depicting a past era. We see songs. Terrific. So I think maybe most people have an opportunity to respond. So we've kind of compared and contrasted the primary and secondary sources with some specific items that we may utilize in this process. And if you want to go ahead and minimize that poll, that would be great, Anna. And that one as well. Excellent. So we'll come back to some of those items that we listed and get into a more concrete definition in a moment. But one of the things that I love doing is something that I've been doing, I feel like it's been nearly 15 years now. But a while back, I had heard about the idea of a mind walk from the Library of Congress. Now they actually title it Leaving Evidence of Our Lives. So whatever you want to call it, you're more than welcome to call it. But this process is really it's the beginning steps of getting students to understand what primary sources are and then helping them to work towards a definition of what are primary and secondary sources. So the idea of a mind walk is really thinking about the evidence that you leave behind in an everyday situation. So what I'd like you to do is think about today. So from the moment you woke up until right now, think about all the activities in which you've been engaged today. So maybe when you woke up, the alarm went off, you woke up, you rubbed your eyes, you maybe made your bed quickly, you went into the restroom, the bathroom, you started to get ready, you ate breakfast, and so on. You went to work, you logged in, you worked with students, and you worked all the way through this current point in your day. Now, what you're going to do in a moment is think about what evidence that you've left behind that proves that you exist, those situations and occurrences happened within your day today. An example that I kind of thought of that where students would have the schema developed to understand at pretty much any grade level, that I've actually used with students from kindergarten all the way through doctoral students here at the university, is the location of a gas station. I think all of our students would have some schema developed to understand what is a gas station and what occurs at a gas station. So what I want you to do is think about a gas station right now. When you pull in, let's pretend you pull in, you go up to a pump. Well, as soon as you pulled in, they probably have video surveillance cameras. So some of the evidence might be somebody looking at a monitor attached to the video camera, and they happen to see you pull up and get out of your car. Maybe it's on a DVR that's recording, so somebody later could get that evidence. Maybe it's actually piped to the headquarters or a security office where they were able to access it there as well. Those would all be pieces of evidence that prove that you pulled up at that moment. They were utilized from the cameras. Then you go up to a gas pump, you run a credit card, you press some buttons, so you got fingerprints left behind, you get a paper receipt, but then there's also an electronic transaction. Now somebody at the next pump looked over, they happened to see you standing there. When you left, you were getting ready to leave, you threw away an old candy wrapper you had in your car, you accidentally flicked some hair follicles out of your head as well. Those were left behind. But then also somebody inside happened to see you, and then when you left, you maybe left a little too quickly and you left rubber on the asphalt, and that was left behind. So as you see, there's many different pieces of evidence. Some are more tangible. Some would have to be accessed through an oral discussion. Some are more permanent. Some are more temporary. A lot of those receipts these days with whatever ink they use from the gas pumps, those disappear many times over time. So there's many different things. Some are electronic. So what I would like you to do is think about your day to day, and Anna's going to pull up a poll. I would like you to think about what evidence you have from your life, from today, from the moment you woke up until now. What kind of evidence do you have that would help in the construction of a narrative about the day in your life? So once again, use commas, list many things. If you want to list 4 or 5 things, that'd be great. And think of some maybe creative ones from your day that may be unique, or even just the normal everyday thing that you do every day of your life. But if you list 4 or 5 of those, separate them with a comma, and submit them when you're ready. All right, I see toothpaste in the sink. Excellent. So the toothpaste itself is a nice piece of evidence. It's not necessarily permanent. We hope that it's not completely permanent. So that's perfect. And that could be also somebody who viewed the toothpaste in the sink. So maybe somebody in your family knew that the sink was clean earlier in the day and then saw the toothpaste in there. We have the school login. That could be electronic, it could be paper. So many of us are using electronic logins these days. So that could be an electronic database. It could be something that somebody maybe printed out that day. Maybe somebody saw you log in. There could be many different pieces of evidence related to that one item. Yeah, perfect. Text messages, Facebook posts, GPS locators. So many of these things in the electronic age we necessarily aren't always thinking about, but they're there. When I talk about this with university students, so many of them bring up the idea of the toll roads we have in our area and how they can really monitor where you are. And then invariably somebody then starts talking about how they can determine how fast you're driving and where you were at all times, and Big Brother's watching you. So sometimes that's something that you don't necessarily think about. I see security wiping the school building with IDs, video footage, excellent. Log into the school network, submitted attendance records, webinar for this evening that you logged in, credit cards at the gas station, ATM receipts, pins, all kinds of great things. So a lot of these could be many actual pieces of evidence related to the one thing. The log into the webinar, I saw your name pop up in participants, so did Anna. So somebody could talk to either of us. They have the record of your names on here. And once this thing's archived, there could be other individuals who might be able to be aware that people logged in and are responding right now in the message board or the poll here. We also have, looks like iPhone alarms, text messages to son, clothing, electronic logs, school cameras, ATM receipts, and student grades. Excellent. So many great things. And these are all those things that we call primary sources. Students many times don't think that their lives are that interesting or they don't matter. So I think that's another thing I love about doing this activity, is they need to understand that they are historical agents as well. They matter. Their history may not be told necessarily every day of their life, be told in the history textbooks or make the national news. But I want students to understand that these are primary sources of their lives. They are historical agents. And I think this is one of those first steps in understanding that. And then also, as I said, understanding what primary sources are. And one of my favorite anecdotal stories I have with doing this is a couple years ago, I did this with a second grade class, and one student just got so excited and blurted out, "This is like Pompeii, all that stuff we're looking at it when we were talking about Pompeii." And I just was gleaning, I was smiling ear to ear and really was appreciative that she said that, because that's exactly what I'm talking about. Yeah, we're talking about things 2,000 years later, but when you go to Pompeii and you see those items and those artifacts, those primary sources, they're the same kind of everyday life things that may seem boring to students today, but they're really, really important when you're trying to construct an evidence-based narrative about somebody's life or about a typical teacher's life, day in their life in 2015, things of that nature. So I like this activity for that reason, because it really helps get them engaged, gets them to think. And once again, students are really interested in talking about themselves. So I've seen students who talk about their baseball glove they left at the baseball field last night, and they were thinking about that, and that came up, or their chores when they took the garbage out, the dirty cereal bowl they left in the sink, things of that nature. But when you start talking about those are primary sources, if I'm going to try to construct a narrative about your life, those are things that are important. And as I start talking and we do some of these activities, feel free to use the chat if anybody has any thought with this, if you think this is something useful in your class, or if you have a modification or anything of that nature. Feel free to pop something up in the chat board in the bottom right there if something comes to mind. So as I said, we listed some things that we considered to be primary sources. We did this activity to kind of lead to the idea of defining primary sources. So what I want us to do now is think about, how would you define those terms? So once again, we're going to pull up another poll. And what I'd like you to do is, in the discussion, the poll discussion line there, if you'll give me some thoughts about how would we go about defining primary sources? What would be vital to the inclusion of a definition of the term primary source? So go ahead and put something in and submit when you have entered it. Purpose. So the purpose of, I'm assuming, the historical account, that you really want to think critically about the purpose when you're looking at primary sources and defining the term primary source. Excellent. I would agree. Talking about something that was left behind by an eyewitness or somebody who was present at that occurrence. I think that's perfect. Original materials produced at the time of the study, and that's vital to it as well, rather than looking at something well after the account or the event. I see an artifact or document created at the time of an event. Excellent. So I would agree, all these things are vital to defining primary source. I've seen a lot of confusion sometimes with primary and secondary sources. And I've been challenged several times because I always say that I can argue that anything is a primary source. And so I've had students and teachers, when I've conducted workshops, argue with me that no, there's certain things that are primary or always a secondary source. And one that comes up is a textbook, that is a secondary source. And I would agree it can be a secondary source, but I can also argue that it can be a primary source. So I think that goes to the item that was listed there as purpose. If I am a professor in the College of Education, like myself, and I'm really interested in textbooks and how they've depicted the Battle of Lexington Green. So what I do is I get a textbook from 1920, 1940, 1960, 1980, and 2000, and I look at each textbook and see how they have depicted the Battle of Lexington Green. Then my purpose is the analysis of textbooks. Then textbook becomes a primary source. So I like using that example because a lot of times students, if they do understand anything about primary and secondary sources, they immediately argue that, well, no, a textbook has to be a secondary source. Well, it can be, but in my case, it many times is a primary source. So what I always suggest to students and teachers is that when we start defining these terms, it's really kind of going to that idea of purpose, that you ask, what is your question? What are you trying to analyze? So if your question is what happened at the Battle of Lexington Green, yeah, the textbook is obviously a secondary source. But if your question is how do textbooks in the United States depict the Battle of Lexington Green, then a textbook changes to a secondary source. So as you see, one item can be one and then another, and sometimes they change depending on the purpose or what question you're asking. Okay, we can close that poll, please. Let's go ahead and look at secondary sources. So then talking about that, we have a poll. How would you define secondary source? What kind of ideas or elements are vital when we define the word secondary source? So I see the word answer. Not entirely sure what is meant by that. If somebody could be a little more elaborate maybe, or give me a sense. So I see analysis or interpretation. Perfect. So really it is, as we said, perfect, after the event occurred, and it is the analysis or interpretation on something that occurred, many times utilizing primary sources. Okay, I see that somebody said it was about the chat box. So real quickly look at the chat box. It says all sources can be a primary source, but not all sources are secondary. Excellent. I've been challenged about whether newspapers are primary or secondary. I'm happy to hear the historical question, which has been my answer. Yeah, absolutely. Newspapers is always something that's really interesting too, because once again, I think if you think about what is your question, if you want to know specifically what happened at the battle or what happened on this date, what happened in Baltimore yesterday, if it's written by an individual who was present in Baltimore, then yeah, I think we could consider that a primary source. If it is written by somebody and then edited and modified, and some editor in another city picked up that article and maybe they're reposting it but have modified and sometimes put a picture with some caption when they weren't even present, then we may argue that that really is a secondary source. Or we could also use the term tertiary source, meaning that it's a primary source within a secondary source. So that is another option as well. But then if I'm analyzing newspapers accounts of what happened in Baltimore yesterday, then they all can be considered primary sources. So as I said, if we always think about what was that question, then I think that will help determine whether it is a primary or secondary source. Good. So we have a good sense. We had a lot of good answers on what primary and secondary sources are, how we define them, and also what kind of things are examples. And so, as I said, I would argue that anything can be a primary source. And I think that any source is valid. Many times they're really poor examples of what we're trying to construct. But in the idea of corroborating your evidence and really analyzing and scrutinizing and thinking about the validity of sources, sometimes a really bad source can be a great source to utilize in your teaching. So as we start with students analyzing different types of primary sources, I would argue that we want to build slowly, have one source that they can analyze. And many times what I'll start with students is I'll utilize a photograph, because students are used to having media all around them. They use photographs all the time. A lot of them are taking photographs. They're using their family members' cell phones or iPads and always taking photographs, so they feel somewhat familiar with them. So one of the things that I do is start with analyzing photographs, but I like to scaffold, especially early on, scaffold the whole learning process, and then remove those scaffolds as they become more proficient in this historical inquiry process. One source analysis sheet that I use a lot is from the Library of Congress. It's pretty basic and it works really good with the novice learners, but it even works later on, even with expert learners, to kind of remind themselves of some of the stages. And the three that they suggest are having students first observe. Well, I guess they can be, I shouldn't say first, because you can go in any order throughout this. It's not necessarily a chronological sequence, but one of the steps you want them to do is observe items within the source. Next, you want them to reflect on some of the elements. And another is to question about the source. And I've seen some difficulty with observe and reflect, because students and even teachers sometimes grapple with where do I put it in observe when it really is a reflect. So what is observe? I would say it's something that's straightforward. You can absolutely definitively say. So if there's a photograph of me like you see up on the screen right now or in front of a classroom, and it's just a photograph of me, I think you could say that it's a man. He is a color photograph. There are books behind him, and if it was in a classroom, you might be able to say there's a whiteboard behind him, things of that nature. But I don't think you could say it's a teacher or a professor without additional information. So that would be something where you're inferring and would go under the reflect stage. So observe should be straightforward. Reflect should be things that you start inferring, could be based on some of the things you observed. And then lastly, kind of straightforward, is question. So if questions arise as you're analyzing any kind of source, especially what kind of things came from your reflections, then you would ask some questions. So in a moment, I'm going to show you a photograph. What I would like you to do is try to go through those 3 stages. So if you want to jot down those words, if you think you might forget them when I go to the next slide, I'm going to have you go through these 3 stages, and you can start with any, go back and forth. Just by the time's over, if you will try to make sure you've at least observed some elements of the photograph. So you have observe. Secondly, you're going to reflect. So reflect on some things and make some inferences based on some observations you made. And then also come up with at least 1 or 2 questions about the image. So I'm going to go ahead and move on to the photograph now. So you're going to take about a minute to go through this photograph and think about observe, reflect, and question. Okay. You can continue thinking, but I'll start talking a little bit. Rather than covering up our photograph with a poll, we're going to utilize the chat board this time. So in the bottom right-hand corner, you have the chat board. What I want you to do is think about observe first. And if you happen to know anything definitively about this photograph, or you happen to have come across it in the past, then please hold on to any thoughts and don't post those right away. But in the chat board, what I'd like you to do is think about some observations. So feel free to put in some kind of thought in there about what you observe. So you can definitively say, I know this. There's no inference or any kind of analysis added to what your observation is. Excellent. Children are sitting in rows. So I think we can definitively say that these are children. They're sitting, and there's rows of desks. So excellent. So that is a perfect observation. Mostly boys in the classroom. Excellent. So you can use some comparison. And if you were so inclined, you could take the time and actually count up the girls versus boys. But I think the idea of just saying more boys or mostly boys is an excellent answer. There's a stove in the room. Perfect. Stove in the corner, boys and girls sitting, adult in the back of the room. I've used this with some different individuals, and there's been some arguments over whether the individual standing is an adult. So that was always been enjoyable when we talk about observation versus reflection. And I've had participants who then get in a debate and say that maybe we shouldn't do that. But I think we could probably definitively say that's an adult in the back of the room. There's a flag hanging in the back. Excellent. Building is made of wood. Old stove in the corner. One girl standing in conversation with another. Excellent. And with the flag hanging in the back, when I was using this one, somebody said that it's an American flag. And just to be a pain and be kind of the devil's advocate and get them thinking a little more, I asked them if they ever seen the flag of Liberia, which is essentially from not being able to see the specific stars on there, could argue that it was Liberia, but obviously I think we can go ahead and argue that it is an American flag, but we want to make sure the observe is a strictly something we can definitively say. We have several children looking at the camera, okay, and we can definitely say we see the eyeballs looking towards the photographer. Mostly dark-haired children. Excellent. So I think we have a lot of wonderful observations, and you guys obviously understand the idea of observe. And as I said, this is a critical step when you get students to start utilizing primary sources. And it works really well with photographs because students will try to say things that necessarily aren't absolutely apparent or something you can definitively say, and they start making inferences and move to the reflect. So now let's post some things reflecting. So we're looking at some things there that we see definitively the boys, more boys than girls. There's a stove, it's wooden walls, wooden building, it's got a flag in the room, there's somebody standing. But what would you start to say about reflections or inferences? Okay, excellent. Seems to be from the past giving the clothing. If that's perfect. I mean, I think that could, some people would argue that go and observe, but I like that you put that in reflect because there's so many of those sepia toned pictures and sometimes reenactments and things of that nature. So until we know for sure when the photograph was taken, that may be more of a reflection. Perfect. I see environment with winter months. Excellent. So that's perfect to think about. Looks like a one-room schoolhouse. Perfect. One thing that I would probably argue, spending most of my time in central and southern Florida, is probably not in Florida, because I don't think I've ever seen a stove in a Florida school. So I think we could. One thing that I would probably add to the reflection stage is it's not in Florida. Anybody want to start inferring where or when this might be? Since we've talked about it looks like it's from the past, maybe winter clothing, winter months, a different environment, one room schoolhouse. So anybody want to take a wild guess at when this was taken? Where? Any reasons for why this photograph might have been taken? Excellent. I'm seeing maybe the early 1900s to 1940s. What about some questions that you have at this moment? I think probably when it was, where it took place, those kind of things. But is anybody left with some really good questions? I really love this photograph, and I'll talk real quickly about why I like it and why I think it's pretty effective, especially with teachers, and can be effective with students, is the idea of schema. If we try to use a photograph or some source for which students really don't have any kind of basis for understanding anything, then it can be very difficult. If I were to present students with a photograph or some information about from the Hussite Museum in Tabor, Czech Republic, I think that'd be difficult for anybody to have the schema developed. I have been blessed to be able to go there, and I love the Czech Republic, so I know exactly. I can picture the museum. I can picture exactly where in Tabor it is, and things of that nature. But I don't think any of my students are going to. So that's the idea of schema. They don't have that developed. But whereas a photograph of a schoolhouse is a good one to start, and you can even use with your students because they've been in school. They know what a schoolhouse looks like, and so they can start analyzing it and thinking about it because they have some schema developed. I see some great questions popping up. So why was this picture taken? Yeah, there must be some reason for why they took it. I wonder why the photograph wanted to photograph the children. What is the photograph trying to tell us? So there might be a specific purpose for why this photograph was taken. It wasn't just a random photograph. Why? What are the two girls discussing? Excellent. Very good. And obviously there's some interesting looks on faces as well. So what is going on? What is this conversation? Why is the girl standing? Why is this important? Are the children from a high socioeconomic neighborhood? So where are these students? Where are they living? What kind of economy at this time? Is it a high socioeconomic class population or not? Is it staged? Excellent. So is this in the moment, or is it staged? Is it something that was reenacted? There's so many great questions. Perfect. So one thing that actually popped up the first time I ever saw this photograph, and people started talking about it. I was engaged in a workshop where some analysis was being talked about this, and I love this photograph. It really kind of spoke to me from my time in classrooms, but it kind of dated me too, because then immediately what I thought about was Madge. I don't know if anybody remembers the Palmolive commercials, and it was Madge, and she would hand wash the dishes, and she kind of had her hands like that, and she would say that it softens hands while she does the dishes. And so I started thinking about that. And what really cracked me up was that then that actually has something to do with the purpose of this photograph. So in a moment, I'm going to pop up the bibliographic information. All right, several of you remember Madge too. So the bibliographic information obviously is one of those things that we want when we have a photograph, and will give us some great information. And in a moment, I'm going to give you that to you, because I think that's one of the things that you can share with students too, to kind of bolster the knowledge and then get to some of these answers and then create new questions too. Before I do, I love the idea, is she pregnant? I think I'm glad it came up, because every single time I've used this image, it has come up in discussion. So then that's another one of those things that people want to put under observe. Oh, she's definitely pregnant. I've had a couple who just absolutely have said she's pregnant. So they argue that that's an observe, where there's like, no, you can't say that. It's a reflection. So I like that. I've heard other discussions about she's the student teacher, she's in the classroom. No, it's another student. And that debate comes out. So I think there's so many good things about this photograph. I'm going to go ahead and move to the bibliographic stage, because that will give you the answer. So it's the daily inspection of teeth and fingernails. So the older pupils make the inspection under the direction of the teacher, who records results. And it was photographed by Lewis Hine. And a lot of you may be familiar with some of his work. He really was trying to capture a lot of images of children, and he really was fighting for better labor laws and better education for children. So there really was a purpose to this photograph. And I love that. And I'm going to go back for a moment. Yeah, the grimace on the seated student. Exactly. That explains a lot about the faces. And that's what I was going to go back to. they're preparing for their analysis of their fingernails and teeth. And so that's why I love the looks on the children. I've heard before that they're, the shifty-eyed kids, and, I wouldn't trust them. I've heard that from students. There's so many great things that come from this in the analysis. But once you understand it, and once again, I think that's something that students then also realize, that when they're utilizing sources, the source of the primary source is vital. So understanding that was Lewis Hine, that this was a process that was going on here, and why it was captured really benefits in this process. So I see, I thought she was reacting to the pregnant student, the one who was grimacing. A daily bathing, a practice then? Great question. So a lot of things will come up. And actually, once again, schema, as soon as I saw them start talking about it, where I grew up, we had the fluoride lady come in periodically, and we had to do the swish. So I remembered we talked a lot about hygiene. And so for a photograph in my classroom, it would have been very similar. We've been sitting in rows, but we've been waiting for the fluoride woman to come around so that we could get our fluoride and swish in our teeth. So I think a lot of times it's fun then to talk about our schema and how that relates to ourselves. And students, anytime you get them talking about themselves, it's always fun. And I have so much to share, and we're already running low on time, so I'm going to kind of move through this next one fairly quickly. Another thing that I love, and I have to give credit to to Cheryl Mason Bollock. She was my advisor at the University of Virginia when I was conducting my doctoral studies, and she has so many amazing ideas. And so I saw her do a hide and seek with students. We were working in Henrico County, which is the Richmond area. And she did this hide and seek game with them using a photograph. And I thought, that is so amazing. So if we had time, I'd go through this, but I do not this evening. But I wanted to explain what I do. It's what Levstick and Barton talk about is the idea of imaginative entry into the past. So I think these kind of things can really engage students, get them really thinking, but having fun at the same time. Well, in this case, I love to play a hide and seek. And as I said, Dr. Bullock is the one that I give credit to for this, because she's the one who introduced it to me. But really, it's the same game as hide and seek that children play outside. So what I do is I explain the rules real quickly, and we'll get them to explain it and talk about the rules. So really making sure that we understand that somebody needs to be the seeker, the rest go and hide. A determined number is set for how long the seeker should count. And then when the time has expired, the seeker tries to go and find everybody. So in this case, with photographs, you can play a game of hide and seek. So what I would have you do is find a hiding place. And I encourage students to think creatively. You can be a bug, you can be a cat, you can be yourself, you can be whatever you want, but find the most creative hiding place that you can find. So a photograph like this, where there's a lot going on, a lot of hiding places, can really get some good discussion. But then as you start to find the students, start asking them questions, especially with senses. So what do you hear? So maybe they say, I hear people talking. Well, what language are they speaking? Oh, I don't know. Maybe English, maybe Italian, maybe German. I don't know. Okay. What do you think they're talking about? Oh, just daily stuff. I see there's some carts here. Maybe they're talking about buying stuff. Oh, okay. Well, there's these carts. What's in the carts? What do you see? And then they can talk about what they see and what do they smell, what do they hear, and if they happen to be hiding in a cart, what are the textures? What do you feel? Are these fresh things? Are they good and fresh, firm fruit and vegetables? Are they mushy? Tell me more about that. So you can really get them to discuss, but then it really gets them to engage. And once again, schema. When we started doing this, I thought immediately of Highlights magazine, where you look at it at an image and then later you try to remember all the elements from it. And it's the same kind of idea. So I would encourage you to try this. Do a hide and seek with your students, and then come back maybe a week later and see how many elements they remember from the photograph. And I would argue that you're going to have a retention of the content longer, especially as you ask all these questions and then get them to think about new questions. So maybe you're left with questions at the end like, where is this? When is it? Is this an immigrant community? And then you can build from that. And then once again, you can pull up the bibliographic information, which I forgot to add to here today, but this is a photograph from Mulberry Street in New York City in 1900. So then you can build from that. Maybe you're doing something about Ellis Island and immigration and talking about immigrant communities in the U.S. So many things that you could discuss, but hide and seek could be that thing. And we have the do nows, or you need something when they walk in the room, or if you're in elementary school when they come back from PE. I think a hide and seek game can be great. Or if you have a break between content, you've been talking about immigration, but you had a week off because of a holiday break or something, and you're like, well, let's get back to thinking about immigrant communities. Let's play a hide and seek. So I think it can be used in a lot of different ways, and you could even use it kind of near the end of a unit. And what I've actually done is use photographs like this at the beginning in a hide and seek, and at the end, I I like Adobe Photoshop and I'm proficient with it, so I'll take digital photographs of children and then place them in this photograph. So they'll be standing amongst these individuals in the photograph, and now it's a writing prompt to talk about, now you are in New York City on Mulberry Street in 1900. Now write about your experiences, or write a diary about your day today on Mulberry Street. And so you can do things like that. And if you're like, hey, I'm not really proficient, it doesn't work too bad if you cut out a photograph and lay them on the copy machine if you have it at the right size, and you can make a photocopy of it, and it kind of looks like they're in there as well. So you can be creative if you want, but I found that to be a tremendous way to assess students at the end of a unit. I see interesting that it's New York City. Lower corner says Detroit. I would have gone with that. And great observation. Excellent. So the Detroit Photography Company actually is the one constructing the photograph. But that's a great thing to bring up, because students, many would say it's Detroit by using the evidence in the corner. Perfect. So as we're building past this capacity and students are moving kind of along a novice to expert level continuum, you're going to want to start building, especially with the scaffolding, and have more complex analysis worksheets. There's so many out there that are tremendous. Just ones that I use many times and have used through the years are the ones from the National Archives. So that just happens to be the one that I have as an example here. And especially what I like about this is, as you see, you have 1 through 6. But let's say on number 6, letter A, list 3 things that the author said that you think are important. Well, in a moment, I'm going to show you an envelope. Well, maybe I want them to specifically look at the date on the stamp on the envelope. So what you can do is actually type in there, look at the stamp and the date associated there. And then when you print out 30 copies of this and share it with your students, then a little additional analysis or direction is on the analysis sheet when they go to work with it. So that's a great thing. Why I like these sheets too, is that you can add your own additional instructions if you need. But then also, if you are in a computer lab or you have iPads or computers, this is electronically available, so they can click on the radio buttons and type in their information and print out these sheets as well. So several options with them. So if you're using the sheet, I have one of my favorite primary sources that I actually own. I bought this on eBay, so I also like to encourage people to go to eBay and look for things you don't have to buy. So please do not run there and buy. I was conducting a workshop a couple years ago out in Colorado, and I had a participant come in the next day and said, I didn't sleep at all last night. I was on eBay all night. So please don't go there and spend too much time. But the thing I love about eBay is it's a really unique primary source repository, because they have, millions of primary sources. So if you go there, you can get some great primary sources. You can print out those primary sources and utilize them in your teaching, and you don't have to buy them, because typically they have amazing photographs of these sources and some descriptions, so you have a little better sense of it. So what I found, I've done a lot with American Homefront during the Second World War, is there are some terrific primary sources up there for that. And if you're curious, how do you find these things? Go to collectibles and then militaria, and you'll see actually kind of a historical timeline of American history. And so then if you want some from the Revolutionary period, you click there. If you want some from the American Civil War, you click there, and so on. So they actually almost chronologically organize the primary sources for you if you go collectibles, militaria. So I think I love eBay. There's a lot of good sources you can get from there that you don't have to buy. If you happen to have $10, like this letter that I have here, then maybe you can buy it. And I see flea markets too. Yeah, absolutely. And what I've found is a lot of the antique dealers are the ones selling things online. So you can get in great conversations with them, and they know so much about what they're selling. So I think that's great. And I see get bargains, things at local flea markets and your antique dealers, and to snap photos of them. That's an excellent idea. If we had a little more time tonight, I would have you really look at this and analyze, but this is a great primary source, so you can grab it from the PowerPoint later if you want it. Feel free to email me. But what I love about this is really start talking and really getting to the process of how do we analyze sources, and how is that different than a typical reading of text in a textbook. I give students the envelope and the letter, and often they go straight to the letter. They don't worry about the envelope, which if you're trying to source it, you can see very quickly, those of you who are historically literate and more towards the expert level, you're like, wow, that happened early in the Second World War for the United States. It's February 26, 1942. And you see it's in Fort Knox. Well, I see that it's from the chaplain. This is really interesting. And you start maybe already thinking about it. It's to Private William Melchiori, but it says Mrs. C. Melchiori. And you may wonder at this point in time, well, Mrs. C may not mean the wife, it may mean the mother. So is this the mother? And start thinking these things through. And also looking at the address, RFD number 2. I mean, that's not something we'll see today. But then as you go through the letter, you analyze in different ways with primary sources. Students often will start top left, move to the right, go top to bottom. But that is a more novice way of thinking, because as Samuel Weinberg would argue, we really want them to source and contextualize before they really get to the process of corroborating and close reading. So I would argue, yes, absolutely, this is vital. You can't understand this letter without having the opportunity to source it and contextualize it, put in the context of American home front during the Second World War, shortly after we entered the war, to understand. And if we had time, we would have been talking about this, but some of the things that I love in this is some of the comments, like, cowards and selfish-minded persons have no place in heaven and no place in America. Now, that gets to the idea of close reading and understanding bias, because if our students are going to read everything and believe them word for word, then they're to believe that cowards and selfish-minded persons have no place in heaven, no place in America. So obviously, that's one of the reasons I like this, is because the blatant, overt bias and guilt tripping that goes on in this letter. And I think that's really a powerful source to use early on when you get students to really thinking about primary sources, their validity, the source of it, the contextualization, and then corroboration. I'd want other letters. I want other information. And then close read. You got to read between the lines. You can't just take everything at face value. So I think this is a terrific letter. As I said, if you can grab it from the PowerPoint, but if not, and you're having difficulty and you want it, feel free to email me. I'll send you a PDF of it. And so another thing that leading from this, once you have students getting more familiar, having some games, having fun with it, really critically analyzing and evaluating sources. Samuel Weinberg at Stanford University and in his Stanford History Education Group, SHEG, they do some great work out there, do some amazing stuff. And one of the resources I like a lot is this. It's a 6-question handout where there are 6 different historical questions, and the students are posed with 2 sources. If these were the 2 sources that you were provided in trying to answer a historical question, which one would you trust more and why? And I always ask them, would you use both of them? Would you use one, not the other? Why? Why would you choose one over the other? And so we really critically think about these. If we had a little more time this evening, I would get you to engage with us and we talk about a specific question, but I'm already running out of time, so I apologize. I want to talk quickly about the sources framework, which will lead you to your investigation. Based on a lot of my experiences and research in the field and my own research that I've conducted, I've been utilizing a framework that I constructed that I call the sources framework. And these are the stages that I like students to go through in the process of trying to construct an evidence-based narrative. As I said, I advocate for starting with one specific source and building from that. So in this case, I have students start by scrutinizing a fundamental source. So what I would do is argue, and what I have done is that you need to start with one source that you find to be fundamental to the understanding of whatever content you're trying to convey. So as I understand that within constraints of a year, you're not going to be doing this with every lesson, but when you can and periodically through the year, have students engage with sources more actively and construct narratives from them. So start with that fundamental source. So that's the first stage. They scrutinize one fundamental source. And depending on what stage they are along the continuum, novice expert level continuum, you decide what scaffolding sheets are appropriate. Maybe it's the National Archives scaffolding sheets, or maybe construct your own. But help scaffold the process when necessary and as much as necessary. The second stage is organizing thoughts. So what I have students do after they finish analyzing a fundamental source, organize your thoughts. So what do I know now? What do I think I know? What do I know about the context around this particular source? So that leads into the third stage, truly understanding that context. So if you don't understand the context, what I do then is provide students with videos, websites, children's literature. Maybe we sit down and we share a piece of children's literature as a class, but getting a better sense of understanding that context. Next, I would ask students to return to that fundamental source now that they have more developed content knowledge and contextual understanding. read between the lines. So think more critically about that fundamental source. What do you understand about it better now? What other things are you thinking about? Do you have any questions? The next stage in the sources framework is to corroborate and refute. So now that we have one source and we feel like we have a decent understanding about that source and the context, now start creating, or depending on the level of the students, maybe you provide them a set of sources in which they can engage and analyze and start corroborating and refuting their thoughts related to the fundamental source. Or if they're more advanced, maybe you have them go out and search and find their own sources that will be able to corroborate and refute their thoughts based on the fundamental source and related question. Next stage is establish a plausible narrative. So I have the students create their own narrative based on the stages leading up. Now, when I say a narrative, that can be done in many different ways. It could be a website. It could be a video. It could be a diorama. It could be a typical history-based paper. It could be many different things, but somehow conveying that they understand the content related to this fundamental question that's kind of leading the whole investigation. And lastly, giving them an opportunity to kind of have this metacognitive process, think about the process of thinking and the process of going through historical inquiry like this. And what are your final thoughts? Did you learn better doing certain things? Did you learn from certain sources better? What kind of questions are lingering? So to wrap up this and leading to your investigation, what are you going to do? What I'm going to ask you to do is go through an exploration of the Lewis and Clark expedition. And this is based on an article that I had published in the middle school journal. So you'll be provided a PDF, or actually the middle school journal agreed to put it online. So you'll be given a web address directly to this article. And what I'd like you to do is read the article and go through and see how I utilize the sources framework in Library of Congress, as well as a couple other sites, their resources, to have students really explore the Lewis and Clark expedition in an authentic manner, but framed by the sources framework. So what you're going to do is scrutinize a fundamental source, as I said, really look at something. Well, we thought, my former doc student and myself, Cicely Shiner Fisher, who's my co-author, we thought that really the key thing we wanted them to look at and really helped set the stage for analyzing this expedition was the letter from Thomas Jefferson to Meriwether Lewis on June 20th. 1803. We thought that was the fundamental source. So what we wanted the students to do is think about that fundamental source, and leading from that, we gave them the fundamental question of what was it like for Lewis and Clark to travel west. So this is an investigation that we constructed together, and my, as I said, former doc student who was working in Seminole County Schools here in Florida, used this with elementary and middle grade students at different capacities. But that was the question we really wanted to gauge them in. So what we had them do is organize their thoughts, think about that fundamental source. So that's what I'm going to have you do as well, and understand that context. So I've given you some additional sources that will help you understand the context. And one of the great ones is Gerard Gawalt's analysis. He is an expert at the Library of Congress. He works with these sources, and he actually has his analysis and discussion on this particular letter. So that's one of the greatest ways to help understand that context. So I've supplied that as well as some other sources to help you really feel like you have a pretty good grasp on the context. So then the next stage is to go back to that primary source and really analyze it. And if there's analysis sheets like the National Archives will be helpful, please utilize those in then trying to read between the lines. Next, you're going to corroborate and refute. I've given you a lot of different sources, some other primary sources that I think would be really helpful in understanding this expedition and understanding what it was like for them to travel west, as well as some general websites and exhibits that are available online. Lastly, but one of the last stages in this process in actually working with the primary sources is establishing the plausible narrative. So I'd like you to think about how you would go about constructing a narrative. If you want to construct your own narrative, that'd be tremendous, but at least really critically think about what do you think would be one of the most effective ways in conveying the knowledge that you've gained. And then the last stage is to really summarize those final thoughts. So think critically about the entire process, what worked for you. Do you feel like you're a historian? Did you think critically like historians do in the discipline? And did you have this appreciation? Because that's one thing I never had in K-12 schools, unfortunately. I never had went through the process of thinking historically. So I really want to see students doing that in the K-12 schools. So that really wraps up the investigation and the framework. And as I said, I ran really quickly through a lot of things, and I'm actually over time at this point in time. So I want to leave it with any last questions. If you want to post anything in the chat, if there's anything you're thinking about, any lingering things, but then also please feel free to get in contact with me. My contact information will be supplied and available through the blog. So if you have any questions or thoughts after the fact, or you want some of the resources that I presented or other thoughts, or you come up with something that you really want to share with me, I would appreciate hearing from you as well. So I guess at this point in time, if there's nothing else, I'll turn it over to Anna.
Thank you, Scott. In the meantime, if you do have some questions for Scott, please don't hesitate to type them in the chat box. As I explained, just share with you some brief announcements. One is that the full investigation will be posted on the Literacy and Learning Exchange later next week. So look for that next week. I will send you an announcement letting you know it is ready. And last but not least, the Dimension 4 Communicating Conclusions and Taking Informed Action webinar is scheduled to take place May 15th. So please mark your calendars and keep an eye out for incoming messages from our system letting you know where to register and how to access that. And that concludes my comments. I see a question, or I see Becky Reed is typing something in the chat box, and want to make sure that we get her information.
And as we're waiting for that, I want to once again thank all of you for being here this evening and participating. It's been really enjoyable for me, and I do encourage you to follow up with me if you have any other thoughts or questions. We see in thinking about Dimension 2 of the C framework, are there similar strategies, frameworks for reading other content areas, economics, civics, geography, and so forth? I don't know specifically off the top of my head, thinking about economics, civics, and geography. Most of my experience has been specifically with history. I'm really a history educator, but I'm sure a lot of the frameworks would work well for them as well. One thing that I like utilizing that I think is very usable that I mentioned earlier is Samuel Weinberg's framework, where he says that we need to source, contextualize, close read, and corroborate. And I did hear in one research presentation, somebody said, well, that doesn't work with everything. It doesn't work with architecture. Well, then somebody else was like, really, I see how it can be. And then I started thinking about it, you really can. Can you source a building? Yeah, absolutely. I've seen really cool restaurants that used to be a gas station. So if you really look at the original source, you could source it. You could also contextualize, look at how it was constructed. It tells you a lot about that time frame and maybe how they were constructing things, and maybe a little bit about the morals and values at that point in time if you look really closely. Also, geographically, if you look at lighthouses throughout the United States, I think that's another great example. So you can close read them and really look at them critically. And then also you can corroborate. Well, I think this is how all lighthouses look, but I want to corroborate with that others. So I think there's certain frameworks like Samuel Weinberg's stages that you can really utilize with anything. I think that would probably work with a lot of different things. So I think you could probably say that with geography, you could probably do that as well in civics and economics. It really depends many times on what sources and what specific content you are trying to convey, but I think that might work as well.
And I wanted to add, number one, thank you so much, Dr. Waring, for doing this wonderful presentation. One of the things I wanted to let everyone know on this webinar, and we will be making an announcement as well via our various channels of communication, is that we will have a C3 Dimension 2 webinar. We just are gathering our panelists. It will include various panelists, so look for that in the coming days as well. If there are no further questions, I wanted to say thank you again to Dr. Waring and to all participants, and wish you a good evening.
Thank you all as well.